Okay, Matthew chapter 6 here tonight. Matthew chapter 6. We are going to continue in our series on the Sermon on the Mount, the Upside Down Kingdom. I don't need to fill most of you in here tonight, but we've been looking at the fact that a life ruled by King Jesus ends up very different than a life that's not. This is pretty standard understanding here. And in fact, if you've sought in any way, shape, or form to live a life where Jesus is king, you have found this. You have probably found many times that the way you live your life is not reflected in the lives of those around you. And oftentimes it can be discouraging. You can feel like a fish out of water, like a stranger in a foreign land, and yet Jesus here preaches this sermon for many reasons, but one of which I think to help us understand that the kingdom that he wants us to live under, this kingdom that is here already and yet is not here yet, there's a future fulfillment, definitely not denying that here, but the place where he rules, the life that he rules, will be inverted from the rest of this world. We've seen that in the series thus far, and I'm not going to recap everything that we've covered here at this point. But in chapter 6, this is the second of 3 chapters in his sermon, Jesus spent some time talking about the fact that we can even do religious things with an eye in the wrong place, right? He was exposing the hunger that we can often have for earthly rewards, specifically the praise of men, right? He taught that if you give to be seen, you might get patted on the back, but that's all you're going to get. If you pray to be seen, you might get a warm, good prayer, brother, but that's all you're going to get. If you fast or sacrifice in order to be seen by men, you might get a human reputation for being really spiritual. That's about all you're going to get. Jesus wanted them to understand the fact that if recognition is what you want, then recognition is what you will get. And that's all you'll get. That reward is pretty thin, isn't it? Really, in the broad scheme of things, that reward is pretty short-lived. It's confined to this life. Frankly, it's a cheap payoff. And not the good kind of payoff. When we give in secret, however, when we pray in secret, when we fast in secret, what we found and what Jesus was teaching here early on in the chapter, then our Father who sees in secret, as he says 3 times, will reward us openly. And one of the things that struck me as I was preparing for the next section that we're going to see here in our text today is the idea that those acts of hidden obedience, that they're investment decisions. They are expressions of trust in a good Father, as he's been saying throughout this particular sermon, who sees, who knows, and who also keeps account. Now, what Jesus is doing is he's moving from the immediate reward of recognition to what really ends up amounting to the larger issue underneath of that in our hearts. He's not just covering why we serve or even why we give or why we pray or why we fast. But what he's really after in this next section is, where are you storing your life? What he does is he shifts from the topic of applause to the topic of accumulation. I want us to look at our text here. We're going to begin in verse number 19 of Matthew chapter 6. What Jesus says here is this: lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves Do not break through nor steal, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. I know these words are very common. You probably were able to quote along with me, mouth along with me, because we've heard these words so many times. And yet, as much as we hear them, as much as I think we know the truth of them, do we live them? Jesus is concerned that those who live under his rule invest their treasures where they will truly last and not be lost. And in doing so, he presents us with what we could call the dilemma of storage. That's the title of my message tonight, the dilemma of storage. And I want to propose to you here this: you are storing your life somewhere. And where you store it says a lot about what you love. You know, the question we're going to face here today is that matter of where are you storing your life? I've got 2 points here this evening if you're taking notes. The first one is this. I think what Jesus is telling us in verse 19 and 20 is that you have a choice, and what you need to do is you need to choose your vault. Look at what he says again back up in verse 19. He says, lay not up for yourselves treasures where? Upon earth. Verse 20, but lay up for yourselves treasures where? In heaven. So you've got 2 vaults here. You've got 2 options of where you store your life. And Jesus is saying, I want you to make a choice. I'm going to make a strong recommendation. And yet, you must choose. It's interesting, as I was studying this, to get a little nerdy here tonight, as he said, lay up treasure. That concept in the first verse is lay not up treasure. In the second verse, lay up treasure. That is something that is called a cognate construction. Now, some of you are scratching your head on the inside, wondering what in the world is a cognate construction. It has to do with grammar here and with language. We have ideas of that in English, but basically, I'm teaching you something. We're going to pull a little bit of the deep dive series into this here tonight, okay? A cognate construction means that you have a verb and a noun that are essentially the same word. Okay? And I'm talking in the Greek here. Literally, it's something like this. What this verse is saying, in essence, if you look at it in the Greek, is do not treasure up treasure. Okay? But treasure up treasure. Don't treasure up treasure, but instead I want you to treasure up treasure. The point is not the treasuring, because we're all going to treasure up our treasure somewhere. The point is, where do you treasure the treasure? Now, those words, treasure here in English, are great words. In fact, the way it's translated is just perfect when he uses the idea of lay up to reflect the concept of treasuring up. Because in English, the noun treasure does a really good job. It gives us the idea as something that's rare and shiny, right? We think of gold. We think of jewels. We think of pirate chests. Treasure, right? But the verb treasure, the English verb treasure, kind of hits us a little differently in English, right? When we think of treasuring something, we think of cherishing something, right? If you treasure your cat, then you cherish your cat. If you treasure your new car, then you cherish your car. If you treasure your coffee, then you cherish your coffee, right? This is something that you appreciate. It's something that you take care of, you could say. The Greek term here for treasuring up your treasure in this passage, it's a little bit more concrete than just cherishing something. A treasure, as I looked up kind of the general background of this word, has the idea not so much of shiny, glittering jewels in a chest, but it has more the idea of a store, not like the corner store, but a store like storage. It has the idea of a reserve or a stockpile, something that's laid away for future use. And the verb has the idea of to store something up or to accumulate or to stash something, okay? Some of you have a stash of candy bars in your house somewhere. Some of you have a stash of chocolate for the fondue fountain, right? Some of you have different stashes. That's the idea of this word. You kind of ferret those things away. My mom would do this in the house all the time, okay? She would take and go to the grocery store and she'd buy these different snacks and stuff, but she wouldn't put them in the cupboard. She'd put them in random places throughout the house so that probably I wouldn't eat them. But she would have those treasured in a particular place. So they were, the treasure is something that's stored or accumulated. To treasure is to store or accumulate. So you could almost say it this way. He's saying, don't stash your stash on the earth. That gets the cognate idea there. But instead, I want you to stash your stash in heaven. Or you could say, don't stockpile your stockpile on earth, but instead, stockpile your stockpile in heaven. Do you see how that works? Are you following me here? That's the idea of laying up your treasure. So the emphasis is not necessarily on monetary value or shininess or glitteriness. The idea is pretty much, where are you stockpiling your life? Because here's the thing, everyone stockpiles something. Everyone builds some kind of reserves. And what Jesus does here in these two verses, 19 and 20, is he reduces the options down to two vaults. And he basically says, choose. Choose your vault. Let's look at the two options here. The first vault we find in verse 19. Lay not up for yourselves treasures where? Upon earth. This is the earthly vault. Again, if you're keeping notes, we can stash our stash here on earth, is what he's saying. And we often do, right? Because earth is accessible. Earth is where we live. What we store here on earth, we can reach. We can see it. We can touch it. We can feel it. We can use it. We can enjoy it. And you know what? We like that, don't we? We like for our stash to be within arm's reach, and therefore we stash our stash. We stockpile our stockpile here on the earth. Now, I got to say this, Jesus here is not condemning stewardship. He's not saying that it's a sin to ever stockpile anything in this life. We need material things to live and to serve God. I've quoted this before. The prudent man foreseeth the evil and hideth himself. Preparation, right, is a biblical matter of wisdom. He's not telling us to be irresponsible. That is not the point of what he's saying here. The Bible affirms wise management, but we've got to understand stewardship is different than storage. It's different than stockpiling. See, he's not talking about managing resources as much as he's talking about stockpiling life. And there's a problem with stockpiling your stockpile on the earth. Look at what he says. Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where? Here's the problem. Moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. Here's the problem with the earthly vault. When we stockpile our stockpile here on earth, the earthly vault is unstable. He talks about the moth, right? Moths can tend to destroy what you might think is secure. You know, you get that clothing, that dress, that wedding dress, right? And you store it away for safekeeping up in the attic, and you think it will forever be exactly as it was when we put it up there. And then the moths come in, or maybe it's not moths, maybe it's mice. Maybe it's not mice, maybe it's squirrels, I don't know, something. Maybe it's moisture, right? But the fact of the matter is, the thing that you thought would be fine if you folded it up and put it away in a drawer, because of them dumb little critters, doesn't remain fine forever. If the moths don't get it, then the mice will, and if the mice don't get it, then the mold will. See, the earthly vault is a vault where things aren't as safe as you might think they are. But he says not just moths corrupt, but he says rust corrupts. Rust corrodes what looks strong, what seems stable. Metal feels so permanent, doesn't it? Looks so nice, and yet all of us who know anything about metal know that though it feels durable and it, in a sense, is, oxidation will quietly eat it from the inside out. And what once looked solid, when rust enters into the picture, will end up flaking away into dust. Isn't that terrible when you take that thing you haven't seen in 20 years in the shed out back, and you finally go in to take a look at it because you finally actually need it for something like you've been telling yourselves for 20 years that you would, and you pull that thing out, and it don't work because it got rusty. See, that's the problem with the vault that's here, the earthly vault. Listen, if the moths, the mice, and the mold don't eat your clothes, then the rust is going to end up eating the things that you thought would be there forever. See, here's the thing. Decay is what he's talking about here. The earthly vault decays. And decay is patient. Buildings deteriorate, don't they? Cars weaken over time. Magazines turn yellow. Film degrades. Data corrupts. Things break down. It's called the second law of thermodynamics, okay? I remember years ago not too long ago actually, pulling out an old VHS tape of family movies, right? And looking forward to watching, what was going on. And so you pull out the VCR, blow the dust off of it. You take the tape, you hook it up, try to find a TV that accepts the old connectors. And you hook that thing up. I remember popping that VHS tape in and right? You remember that sound that it makes when it's not quite tracking right? And I can adjust the tracking to get it to go, but it wouldn't. And the reason why is whether it was the VCR or the VHS tape, they break down over time. You might think you have those memories forever, but the fact of the matter is, decay will take its toll on your stuff. That's the problem with the earthly vault. And if the decay doesn't get it, then theft might. Again, he says, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. I remember as a child we had an old, I don't remember what kind of van. I think it was a Ford. It's red, like a burgundy and like a cream color, cream stripe down the middle, burgundy on the top and the bottom. And I remember in that van, we had a little briefcase. It was faux leather, and inside the briefcase, we had a lot of cassette-shaped slots in the little plastic insert. And we had a whole library of fun cassette tapes. Okay, everybody knows what a cassette tape is, right? Luke, you know what a cassette tape is? Okay, very good. He's like the youngest one in the room right now. So, yes. And, I love those. We had everything from, Christian choral numbers to okay Disney songs, okay, just being honest. We had everything in between. We had Barry Webb Puppet Castle, cassette tapes. Some of you remember them. We had all kinds of stuff. And I remember one day coming into the van and reaching down to grab our faux leather black briefcase that sat in our van that sometimes was unlocked. And I remember, where is it? Where is it? I remember getting down on the floor, looking back underneath all the bench seats in our old van. I thought maybe it slid to the back. I didn't see it. And we kept looking for it, and eventually we concluded that it was stolen. And we laughed at the fact that they stole a bunch of Bible tapes. I think we even had like some Scorby KJV readings and stuff like that. Imagine stealing Christian tapes. But I remember something that day even more than the humor of it. I remember the feeling. Nothing is safe. Have you ever had something stolen from you out of your house or your garage? You know that feeling. And what Jesus is trying to do is he's trying to help us understand the earthly vault. It is subject to corruption, to decay, and it is not safe. If the moths don't get it and the rust don't get it, then the thieves might get it. And you know what? The older you get, the more categories you add to those three, right? Yes, we've got moth. Yes, we've got rust. We've got mold. We've got inflation, right? We've got taxes. Yes, we have theft, but you know what else we have that can corrupt our stuff? We have toddlers. Toddlers can do that really well. And then time. The earthly vault exposes everything that we store in it to all of those things. See, this isn't just about gold versus silver, like maybe you could argue in 1 Corinthians 3 in the judgment seat. This is about strategy. If you store your treasures, if you stockpile your stockpile here, you are literally placing it in a system designed to decay. The earthly vault, I think what Jesus is saying here, puts your treasures at risk. But thankfully, that's not the only option, right? Verse 20, he goes on, he says, don't do what he said in verse 19, don't store it there, but verse 20, lay up for yourselves treasures. Where? In heaven. If vault number 1 was the earthly vault, then vault number 2 is the eternal vault. Okay? This is another place where you can stockpile your life. That's in heaven. And this vault operates very, very differently. You see, on earth, what you store is accessible to you, right? You can see it, you can touch it, you can monitor it, you can enjoy it, you can log into your app and see what the latest numbers are in your earthly vault. But the heavenly vault, that's a little different. Kind of feels at first glance like a retirement account that you can't log into. That's what the heavenly vault kind of feels like, isn't it? It kind of looks like you invest in this vault, but you don't see immediate return. And from a purely earthly perspective, that vault feels uncertain, doesn't it? Now, you know in your head that it's not. And yet, man, the stuff in this vault, you can see it. But the stuff you send in that vault, you can't see it. See, that vault has to do with walking by faith. That vault is treasure that's delayed. That vault feels risky, even though it's actually not risky at all. See, the real risk is not storing your treasures in heaven. The real risk, according to Jesus in these 2 verses, is storing your treasures here. That's the real risk. See, look at what he says at the second half of verse 20. He says, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. You see, in this vault, the eternal vault, your stockpile, your treasures don't break down. There are no pests that chew them up and make a little nest in them. That doesn't happen in the eternal vault. There is no rust that ruins the structural integrity of what you put in there. There, they are truly and completely safe. Treasures stored in heaven aren't preserved that way because the conditions are better. They're preserved because heaven is not subject to the curse. Nothing there ages. Nothing there erodes. Nothing there leaks. Isn't that wonderful? See, how many of you ever had a kid that left a plastic toy outside all summer? Anybody ever had a kid that did that? You know, they leave it in the sun. And what happens when they leave it outside? The sun bleaches the colors. The sun breaks down the plastic. The rain that happens causes the hinges to rust. That plastic gets brittle, and one hard bump, and snap, the little Playmobil is busted, right? Even if you bring it inside and never leave it outside in the sun and rain and weather. That little toy, the decay might slow down a bit, but it doesn't stop. Heaven is not a place of slow decay. It's not a matter of taking a toy from the outside and bringing it inside where it will decay slower. You got to understand, in heaven, there is no decay. It does not corrupt. It does not break down. Taxes don't eke away. And I remember when I was a kid, my parents wanted to teach me how to save, and so they opened up a savings account at a Columbia Savings Bank. I hope they hear this particular sermon, okay? And I remember at some point, apparently, they sent us a letter and said this child account is no longer going to be without fees, and it was a tiny little fee. We missed the letter. And I remember at one point going into the account, we'd only put $100 or $200 in it, but I remember it was plumbed down to zero, and that taught me really well how to save. I remember thinking, I ain't ever putting another dime in this bank for the rest of my life. That was a wasted investment. I didn't use the word investment because I think it was like 10, but I remember it hit me that was a bad vault. The vault of heaven will never do that to you. What you put in will not break down. It will not get taxed. It will not get reduced in value based on inflation. That is not going to happen in heaven's vault because it's incorruptible, what ends up there. Last week I got a word from John Leisher, who works for the City of Fairmont Water Department. He's the guy who monitors all the meters, and he said, hey, Pastor, he sent me a text. Hey, Pastor, just so you know, you've got some sort of water going continuously at the church property. It's not a lot, but it's something you should probably look into. So I remember I texted John Swiger, and he looked around, couldn't find anything. And I came, and I am totally going through this whole building, looking at every toilet, opening up the backs of the toilets, trying to figure out what's going on. I went back into the trailer. I'm trying to figure this out, and eventually I turn off the water to the whole front half of the building, and I text John, hey, is the water stopped? He texts back, he waits a few minutes. Nope, it hasn't stopped yet. All right, so I turn off the water to the whole church building, and I text him, hey, has the water stopped? He's like, nope. So I go over and I turn off the water inside the elementary building, and I text him and I say, the water stopped now, right? He texts me back, says, nope. And I'm thinking, where else is there? And so I went down that pit, and I saw there were 2 valves, and I turned off the valve to the elementary building because I was sure maybe it was between the pit and the elementary building. A leak had sprung because of the cold or something. I turned that off, and I could see the meter down there. I didn't need to text John anymore, and it kept going up, and I thought it's not the elementary building. But I thought I turned off the whole church building, so I turned off the valve to the church building, and it stopped. And I thought, oh no, we've got a leak in the line to the main church building. I thought, wait a minute. What about the trailer out back? So I turned off the valve to the trailer, went back in the pit, and the meter had stopped. I went inside, and just to try something, I turned off the valve to the toilet, turned back on the valve to the house, went back in the pit, and it was stopped. That dumb toilet. I have no idea if it was the flapper or the flipper or the flooper in that thing. I don't know what it was. It didn't look, I looked at it, it didn't look like it was leaking, but it was. And I'm thinking, how does that happen when nobody is using it? I don't know, but you know what? Things break down. I don't know if we'll have toilets in heaven. But if we do, the flapper and the flipper and the flooper, they're not breaking down, okay? Because what you put in the vault of heaven is incorruptible. See, the treasures in heaven do not grow brittle. They do not wear out. They do not deteriorate through use. They do not deteriorate through neglect. They are secure because they're in the place where corruption doesn't exist. See, the eternal vault, the vault of heaven, is the only vault that will not fail. See, the earthly vault, it's here. You can touch it, feel it, count it, even stroke it if you want. The vault of heaven, you can't see it. You can't touch it. You can't count it. You can't feel it. But here's the thing. The stuff here will decay. The stuff here will not. And Jesus tells us, choose your vault. If that were all we knew, this would be easy, right? This should be easy. With that understanding, why in the world, right, would anyone ever stockpile their stuff here? Why would anybody do that? And yet they do. And yet we do. All the time. Right? Right? See, Jesus, in verse 19 and 20, he's laying out the two vaults and asking us to choose. But in verse 21, the final verse we're going to focus on here tonight, he takes a little bit of a different turn. He says, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. See, if in verse 19 and 20 he tells us to choose your vault, in verse 21 he tells us to check your heart. To check your heart. Because here's the thing I want you to get, and I don't want you to forget it. Your vault reveals your values. See, in verse 21, he stops describing vaults, and he starts exposing hearts. This is not about metal or moths anymore. Instead, verse 21 is about our affections. It's about what we love. It's about where our loyalty lies. And in many ways, this verse functions like a spiritual portfolio review. How many of you know what a portfolio review is? Okay, maybe a few people know the terms. You see, this is not God pulling your records and your portfolio in order to shame you. This is Jesus handing you your statement and saying, read it. Read it. You see, what Jesus is trying to get us to do is to examine our investments. To examine our, I'm using terms here, asset allocation. He's causing us and challenging us to examine our long-term strategy. And when we do that, we will discover something deeper than numbers. You'll discover your loves. The things that you truly treasure and the things that you truly value. Because you see, your stockpile happens through deposits. Your vault levels happen through choices that you make on a regular basis. You could say it this way, your deposits reveal your direction. Or you could say it this way, your allocation reveals your allegiance. You could say your risk tolerance reveals what you trust. And Jesus is giving us here a simple vault audit. And he's trying to help us understand what those numbers say about our hearts. No spreadsheets required, okay? So there's two questions that I think he's forcing us to see in this matter of check your heart. The first question is this: where's your vault? See, the first point, verse 19 and 20, he's just laying out the two vaults. He's saying, I wouldn't choose this one if I were you. That one's just going to break down or it's going to get stolen. I'd choose this one. But in verse 21, he's not laying out the two options. It's as if he's looking at you saying, all right, here's your audited report. What's it say? Where is your vault? Where your treasure is, he says. So then you need to ask yourself the question, where your treasure is, or where is your treasure? Take an objective look at your life. Where is your accumulation? Where is your stash, as we've been saying? Where's your treasure? If you think of what you would consider to be the greatest investments of your entire life, what would your mind turn to? What would you list? What would be on that little printout in your brain? Would it be your house? Would it be your truck? How about your library? Would it be your guns? Your land? Your 401k? Your savings account? There's nothing wrong with any of those, just to be clear, okay? I'm not preaching against having land, owning guns, owning a truck. I got a truck, no guns, but I got a truck, okay? But if your earthly vault is full, but your heavenly vault is empty, you've got a bad risk exposure rating, okay? Because remember, the earthly vault breaks down. It's at risk of rot. The heavenly vault doesn't. It's good forever. So as you personally assess, where have I invested my life? Which vault are you depositing in on a regular basis? See, there may be some here in this room, you're still on the early side of life, and you're making regular deposits into one of those vaults. Which vault are you depositing into? Where is your extra energy going? Where is your time being deposited? Where is your money flowing? Where are your thoughts going to when nothing demands your brain? Because here's the thing, you do not accidentally stockpile anything. The deposits that you make are deliberate choices, and each one of us are making them. Which vault is your life going into? But some of you, you're getting closer to the tail end of life. You spent your entire life accumulating in some way, shape, or form. And I'm sure it's probably the case your kids have no idea that your quality of life wasn't built in a day, right? It's been grown over a lifetime through daily investments and daily decisions of priorities and daily choices to think ahead. And that's not bad. There's nothing bad about that. Please don't misunderstand me here. But where is the accumulation? Where have those daily deposits been focused on throughout your life? I remember personally as a teen making daily deposits. I know this is going to sound dumb because it is. Into my video games. That was my life. That's where I poured much of my time and much of my money into as a very incredibly irresponsible teenager. I spent hours building my game library. I had shelves of video game magazines. I had records on those games, high scores on those games. Like, man, I had poured a lot of time in something that frankly didn't matter at all. That was some of what was in my vault. What's in your vault? Listen, there's lots of things we can spend our time, our effort, our money, and our energy on. If you could look back over your life, what have you been sticking in your vault? Your earthly vault throughout your life. How have you been spending the finite resources that God has given to you? I'm not just talking about money, okay? I'm talking about your life. We're all stockpiling something. Maybe you've been stockpiling comfort. Maybe you've been stockpiling reputation. Maybe you've been stockpiling security. Maybe you've been stockpiling possessions. Maybe you've been stockpiling experiences. Maybe you've even been stockpiling ministry recognition. That can be an earthly stockpile too, by the way. What are you stockpiling? And where? See, you have two choices. Every investment, every treasure that you acquire is going in one of those two vaults. One is high risk, the other is no risk. Here's the thing. He's essentially forcing us to answer the question, where is your treasure? Because he says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. That's the second question here. Not just where is your vault, but secondly, what are your values? What are your values? I think this is somewhat of the shock here in the text, because I think a lot of times we look and we think, oh, my heart determines my treasure. But what Jesus is saying is that your treasure determines your heart. Let me put it to you this way, as one resource put it, you don't drift towards what you value. You are drawn towards where you invest. In other words, you put your treasure somewhere and you know what's going to happen? Your heart is going to migrate towards that vault. You invest in status and your heart will cling to reputation. You invest in comfort and your heart will fear inconvenience. You invest in money and your heart will tremble at market fluctuation. You invest in heaven, and your heart will long for eternity. Because here's the thing, your vault, as we said earlier, reveals your values. But here's a sobering implication. If your heart feels cold towards heaven, check your deposits. If your affections are tangled in earth, then maybe you ought to trace your investments. Because see, the vault is not just storage. It's also a compass that tells you what direction your heart is facing. It tells you what you truly love. See, you don't reveal your heart by what you say that you value. You reveal your heart by where you store your life. Jesus is challenging us, choose your vault, but check your heart. I think most of us here in this room, probably all of us here in this room, we love the Lord, right? Right? Okay, good. I thought so. But loving the Lord and investing in heaven are not always the same thing. Not talking about tithing here. Not talking about squeezing more money out of an already generous church. Please don't misunderstand me. These are just the next few verses, okay? But I think it's important for us to recognize in this text, Jesus isn't fundraising. He's diagnosing the people that he's preaching to. So let me ask this plainly. Does heaven actually hold your heart? Or is your heart quietly tethered to earthly vaults? Oh, we all say heaven's better, right? Right? We sing about it. We preach about it. We tell others to live for heaven. But if we're honest, some of us are pretty attached to things down here, aren't we? See, we don't just use earth, we lean on it. We don't just steward things, we rely on them. And you can tell when something down here has your heart. If the thought of losing it unsettles you more than the thought of losing fellowship with God, chances are the earthly vault has your heart. If financial fluctuation disturbs you more than spiritual dryness, then chances are the earthly vault has your heart. If your reputation matters more than obeying God, then chances are your earthly vault has your heart. If your comfort weighs heavier in your priorities than your calling, then maybe the earthly vault has your heart. That's not stewardship. That's storage. If you get more excited about upgrades than about eternity, if you check accounts more than you check your soul, if you worry about retirement more than you worry about reward, and your heart's telling on you. Jesus is not asking us here whether we believe in heaven. He's asking us whether you're building towards heaven. You can live in West Virginia. You can work here, raise your family here, serve faithfully here. But your vault better not be here. Because whatever you store here is exposed to moth, rust, time, loss. If you say you love heaven, then invest there. If you say you're living for eternity, then let your deposits prove it. Choose your vault. And if your heart feels stuck to this world, don't defend it. Move your treasure, because then your heart will follow. Lord, thank you so much for this somewhat gut-wrenching diagnostic. Lord, would you help us be tethered to heaven and not tethered to earth in our hearts? Lord, we know that you don't have a problem with money. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. And Lord, we do not want to be guilty of stockpiling our stockpile in the wrong place. So Lord, would you show us what that looks like? Spirit of God, I want to ask very specifically for each person here in this room, would you show them what daily deposits in the eternal vault look like for them? I'm not going to tell them, but you can tell them. And I ask that you would. Thank you for this text. Would you help us live it? In Jesus' name, amen. Jason, why don't you come?